There is a simple 3-step process that will solve 90% of your photography issues. So if your photos are too bright, too dark, too noisy, a little bit blurry, or pretty much anything in between, this video is for you. Over the last few months, I've had random encounters with other photographers in the wild where they couldn't quite figure out why their photos weren't turning out. And in all of those examples, I was able to solve their issues with the method that I'm about to show you. So step 0, before we get started, we want to reset our camera. We're not actually gonna factory reset it, but we're gonna make sure some of the core functionality is working. So turn on your camera, and you might notice that your lens has either an autofocus switch or an image stabilization switch, or sometimes you can find that setting inside of your menu. So we wanna make sure that our autofocus is turned on and our image stabilization is turned on. Also, you wanna make sure your camera isn't locked. So my Canon cameras all have a button on the top that when you lock it, locks all of the functionality of the camera and prevents you from changing any of the settings. So make sure, for the sake of this tutorial, it's unlocked. Now there are some default camera settings that I recommend using depending on the shooting situation that you're in, but I'm gonna share those at the end of the video and tell you how you can find the default settings for yourself. So the biggest problem that I see, someone will hand me their camera and the screen is just completely black, meaning the exposure is too dark. And usually that's because one of the settings, either aperture, shutter, or ISO, are cranked and they're in shutter priority, TV mode, or aperture priority, AV mode, and the camera is just freaking out, like it doesn't know what to do. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take that all back, put our camera into manual mode, or M, on our mode dial, and we're gonna start with aperture. In most cases, you want to take your aperture setting and lower it as far as it will go. Now, depending on the lens that you're using, you might have a higher minimum aperture. So some kit lenses only go down to f5.6, others go down to f4. This is a really nice lens that actually goes down to f1.4. And what that means is I can actually let more light into my camera. So what we want to do is, if our image is too dark, we want to let in as much light as possible. So go down to f5.6, go down to f4, to f2.8, or f1.4 if you have it. Now, if you lower your aperture all the way down and you take a photo like this one of this landscape, you might notice that some of the elements are out of focus or a little bit blurry. Now, in this case, because I was focusing in the background, some of those foreground elements that are really close to the lens are actually gonna be out of focus, because a camera lens, the way it works, is it has to focus to something, whether that's something in the foreground or something in the background. So what I wanna do is, if I want more of that in focus, I might actually have to raise my aperture back up. So instead of shooting at f2.8 or f4, one of those really low aperture numbers with that really shallow depth of field, I might want to try f8 or f16 to get a little bit more in focus. Another reason you might want to try a larger aperture number with a bigger depth of field is if you're shooting something like a group photo. So if you're shooting a whole bunch of people all in a line, or maybe you're doing a wedding and there's multiple lines of people, if you shoot everything at f1.2 or at f1.4, some of those people aren't gonna be in focus. Or a better example is if you shoot a portrait like this one that I actually shot at f1.4, you'll notice that part of my face is in focus right around my eye, but then the back of my ear and the front of my nose is a little bit out of focus. Now, some photographers like this shallow depth of field look, but if you're shooting a portrait or a subject and you want more of it to be in focus, try increasing your aperture. Now, that will have the negative effect of darkening your photo, so that's where we need to move on to our next setting, which is shutter speed. This is really where you're going to start experimenting. So shutter speed is gonna depend a lot on the subject that you're shooting. Now, in my case, I like to start somewhere at around 1/100 or 1/200, because in most cases, that is a shutter speed that I can handhold without getting extra camera shake. Because no matter how steady you think your hands are, no matter how good the image stabilization inside of your camera or your lens is, you're gonna naturally be a little bit shaky. And if you've had maybe one too many coffees for the day, you're probably gonna be even more shaky than normal. So what I would do would be to start around one of those mid-range numbers, 1/100, 1/200, and then adjust and go lower until you realize that you can't handhold it anymore. Or maybe you have a moving subject. Like if you're shooting a fast moving car at a really slow shutter speed, like 1/20 or 1/30, you might notice that the car is blurry. And so instead of using that slow shutter speed, you might need to speed it up. Or you might need to do a panning technique where you're actually tracking and following the car so the car is nice and sharp, but then the background is blurry or out of focus. That's actually what's called motion blur. And if you wanna see more slow shutter effects, more long exposure photography tips, I actually have a whole video series that I did on it that I'll link up here. I'd recommend starting there because there is also another rule known as the 2x shutter rule that can come in handy depending on the lens that you're shooting with, but that's a little bit more advanced than I want to go into this video. For this, all you need to know, try starting at around 1/200, 1/100, and then either increase it to make it faster, or 1/500, 1/800 if you have a fast moving subject, or if you feel like you can get a little bit steady, you can probably lower that down to maybe 1/80, 1/50, somewhere around there, but it really is up to you to see what works for your particular photo. Now, if your photo is a little bit noisy, this is where we want to get into the ISO setting. So the ISO, or ISO, depending on how you want to say it, I think both ways are correct, but some photographers will have a preference. Let me know which one you prefer down in the comments. But ISO is kind of like the gain knob or the volume knob on an amplifier or on a speaker, where more gain or more volume or more ISO means your camera sensor is gonna be more sensitive. So at some point, you're gonna reach a nice balance of ISO that makes your photo look nice and exposed. But if you go too far and you crank it too loud, it can start to hurt your ears. Or in this case, you can start to introduce noise or grain into your images. Now, some of the images that I've showed you as examples in this video, I've shot at a higher ISO setting because it was a low light scenario where there wasn't a lot of light available. But typically when you're shooting in the day, you can use a lower ISO setting like 100, 200, or even 800 if it's maybe a little bit cloudy out. But all those photos that I'm showing you have been edited with my Lightroom presets. And if you're someone who is brand new to photography and have never edited your raw photos before, and you're maybe wondering, how do I get started in this? I do have my Lightroom presets linked down in the description below. I actually have two sets of presets. I have my Division 1 presets and my brand new Division 2 presets, which there are 18 unique presets, 32 in total, so 2 versions of each of the presets. And if you pick up my Lightroom presets, I actually have full-length tutorials that walk you through how to install them on any version of Lightroom, and I even include some sample files. So if you're wondering, how does Anthony edit all of his photos, you can actually see the before and the after and follow along as I edit. But let's say you've shot your photos in a low light condition with less light and they come out a little bit darker. Well, presets might not work because you do need to kind of nail your exposure inside of camera. And if your exposure is too dark, one of the settings that you might want to look at is actually the ISO. So you might want to try boosting it from 100, 200, all the way up to 1600 or 3200. Once you start getting into those really high numbers like 12,000, 10,000, 25,000, that's really when you can start to notice a lot of noise. Now, newer cameras like the R6 and the R5 that I'm recording on have some pretty good ISO performance at some of those high numbers, but honestly, don't be afraid to crank your ISO if it means that's your last resort for getting the shot. Typically what you want to do is set your aperture, set your shutter, and then the ISO is kind of like that floating value that fills in the gaps and lets you get a correct exposure. So one of the cheat codes that I actually like is that instead of telling my camera what ISO to shoot at, is I will actually use auto ISO. So I'll shoot full manual, control my shutter, control my aperture, even sometimes control my focus and my focus point, but then put my camera into auto ISO and really let the camera do the rest. Okay, so let's say you've done all of that, you've set your aperture, you've set your shutter, and you've set your ISO, but you're still not quite sure. Like, you're like, Anthony, my camera settings are way off. Like, why am I shooting at f16 and some crazy high ISO number? Like, just give me something to start off when I'm shooting. So there is actually a rule known as the Sunny 16 rule. And this worked really well back in the days of film when we didn't have all these crazy digital light meters built into our camera and all this artificial intelligence. And so what a lot of photographers would do is they would start with a film ISO of 100 or 200. In this case, we'll say 100, set their aperture to f16 and choose a shutter speed of about 1/100 or 1/200, depending on how light it was out. And on a bright sunny day at 12 o'clock in the afternoon, if you use those exact settings, you can pretty much nail your exposure. Now, of course, that's gonna depend on the subject that you're shooting and the camera and all these various different variables, but I like to tweak that a little bit. So you can also say, you know, instead of f16, you can go f8, ISO 100 and maybe 1/200, 1/400. But typically, if I'm out shooting and I may be in a little bit more of a shade condition or a little bit of an overcast condition, I'll actually use f4, 1/250, and an ISO of around 500 or 800, because that's kind of a little bit more in the middle of the road. And then that way, let's say I have a fast moving subject like a car or somebody running, then I have enough room, I have enough flexibility with the ISO 800 that I've chosen to actually crank my shutter speed to maybe 1/1000 or 1/2000 so that I can stop the motion inside of my frame and avoid any of that blurriness that you typically get with camera shake or with a fast moving subject. So those are pretty much the default camera settings that I use with my camera whenever I'm out and I'm not quite sure what I'm gonna be shooting, but you might wanna give those a try or just follow that simple 3-step process where you set your aperture, you set your shutter, and then you set your ISO, or you throw it into ISO if you kind of want to use that little cheat code. So hopefully you found that helpful, and I'll link more videos at the end of this and in the cards at the top that you can check out if you want to dive more into shutter speed or the various settings of your camera. And until the next one, grab your camera, get out, and go shoot photos.